So, welcome back to the Adult Chair Podcast, Kristin Neff.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really glad you invited me back.
Yes, I am really, really happy to have you because this to me, I was just sharing with you, is such an important topic. And I do not feel that people exactly understand what it is, who it's for, and how to apply it. And the power of it. It sounds like such a simple term. Oh, self compassion. Oh, that's easy. No, 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 no.
Yeah.
It will change your life.
Yeah.
And I don't say that lightly. And I also said to you in my next book, I've quoted you quite a few times because in that chapter, I have a whole chapter, and self-compassion is so important. So you are the researcher on self-compassion. And thank you for the work that you've done because it is such an important topic. Let's start out with what self-compassion is. What is it?
Right. So if you break down the word compassion in the Latin, passion means to suffer, come as with. So it's really how do we show up for suffering? And
Mhm.
normally we think of it as how do we show up for other people when they're suffering? And so self compassion is simply how do we show up for ourselves when we suffer? Are we warm? Are we kind? Are we supportive? Do we listen like we would with someone else who is suffering? Or, more typically, do we beat ourselves up, shame ourselves, blame ourselves, and actually kneecap ourselves in our ability to get through difficult moments?
Mhm.
And the research really is pretty overwhelming at this point. There's like over 7,000 studies showing that if you show up for yourself with kindness, warmth, and support and a sense of connectedness, which is really kind of the more formal definition of self-compassion, which I can get into. But if you show up with yourself with these three elements, you're present with yourself mindfully, you feel connected to others. You realize you're a human being. You aren't alone. And you're kind and warm with yourself. It will radically change your life for the better. Reduce things like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, even increase happiness, life satisfaction. So it's really, and it's not that difficult. I mean, it's hard to remember to do, and there are blocks that get in the way. But we already know how to do it for other people.
Right?
The trick is to show up for ourselves the same way we show up for those we love.
So why don't we? Why don't we have what I would call, I don't know what the term would be. I'm just making this up, but like, why don't we naturally have self-compassion
Yeah.
versus, like you said, it's so much easier to have compassion for others if someone else is going through a hard time. Most humans, not all, but most of us show up and, oh, what's going on? How can I help you? It's, and we're compassionate with them. But why do we have such a hard time?
Well, so I hope people don't beat themselves up for beating themselves up because it's actually more natural. So there's two reasons. There are both evolutionary and cultural reasons. So evolutionarily, so we're designed as human beings when we are personally threatened to go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. I'm sure your listeners have heard about this or you talk about this, right? So when we're threatened, and of course we feel threatened either when we make a mistake or we fail in some way or we feel inadequate, or if something really difficult happens in our life. When we feel personally threatened, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. But of course, the problem is in us, right? We're the problem usually. So we turn that response inward. We fight ourselves with criticism, kind of from the innocent desire, thinking that maybe it'll help us get our shit together so we'll be
Right.
safe, or we flee into a sense of shame and isolation, right? We kind of feel like we're going to protect ourselves from the judgments of others and we hang our head in shame, or we freeze and we get stuck and we ruminate, which of course just makes things worse. Now when your best friend, for instance, maybe makes a big faux pas at a party, you aren't so personally threatened, so you're actually more able easily to tap into another system that evolved, which is natural, the care system, but that honestly evolved more to care for others, like our family members or our group members, which is where we extend warmth and feeling of connection. So it's more natural to respond to ourselves with the threat defense system and our friends with and our loved ones with the care system. So we have to do a little hack, right? And we can do it, but we have to start treating ourselves like we treat our loved ones. And then we tap into, like, physiologically, when you put your hand on your heart, just as if someone else puts their hand on your shoulder, your body responds the same way. Like cortisol lowers, heart rate variability increases. So we can do the hack, but it's not natural. So that's just one reason. And then add to that culture. I mean, almost no one was raised with the idea that it's good to be self-compassionate. We're taught we should be self-sacrificing. We
Yeah.
should always put others first, right? And so people think like it's a zero-sum game, as if we give 3 units of compassion to ourselves, we'll only have 2 left over for others. It doesn't work that way. The more compassion flows inward, actually, the more we're able to show up for others. And people, we can get into it. There's all sorts of like baloney myths, like it's going to undermine your motivation. It won't. It increases it. People think it makes you weak. It doesn't. It makes you stronger. So there's a lot of misconceptions about self-compassion that frankly just stand in the way. They're roadblocks that they're fake. They're myths. They aren't true.
I have heard that before. And maybe it was because I read some of your research for my book.
Yeah.
The whole part about making you weak, though, I think I probably read it from you, but it's interesting that people would think that if we speak compassionately to ourselves, then it weakens us and we should be tough and we should push through and we should keep going and don't cry and don't show the emotions and just
Yeah.
keep going. It's like, no, no.
No, right. Well, and also, and I should say there are two main faces of
Mm,
self-compassion, which I like
you're
to
right.
call the tender and the fierce.
Yep.
Tender self-compassion is about acceptance. We accept ourselves as flawed human beings. We accept our emotions. Things are hard. Life is hard sometimes. But there's
Right.
also fierce self-compassion. So, one way compassion is defined in psychology is concern with the alleviation of suffering. That's a broad definition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so sometimes acceptance, like accepting ourselves, helps alleviate suffering. We aren't superhumans, but we don't want to accept all our behaviors if they're causing harm. And we certainly don't
Mm-hmm.
want to accept situations we find ourselves in that are unhealthy. So,
Mm-hmm.
fear self compassion is all about taking action to protect ourselves. Maybe saying no, drawing boundaries, leaving harmful relationships or toxic work environments. Or it's also about providing for our needs, figuring out, well, what is it that I need to be happy, and actually doing
Mm-hmm.
something to make that happen. And then motivating change. So motivating change is a huge part of healthy self-compassion. And so that's part of the confusion. People think it's only about the tender acceptance. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's about doing things. Um,
Mm.
but also, think about it. If you had a friend who's really upset and you say you're so stupid, I hate you, is that really going to make them stronger, more able to deal with the challenging
No.
situation? You're just going to depress your friend and it can make it, a million times harder. But if you say, hey, I'm here for you, what do you need? And I got your back, that's going to make your friend stronger. And it's the exact
Mm.
same thing with ourselves. If we're an ally as opposed to an enemy to ourselves, of course we're going to be stronger when facing the battle of life. It's so funny. It's kind of obvious if you think about it, but people just have all these kind of preconceptions that it's just about, oh, well, poor me. That's not self compassion. That's something like self pity. It has nothing to do with showing up for yourself in a healthy way.
Give us some examples. I like that you just said that it's not about self-pity. And I think some people might fall into the victim stance and, and go there. And that's not self-compassion. So can you discern, like, tell us the difference
Yeah.
there?
So when I first decided to research self-compassion, I had to come up with an operational model so I could create a scale to measure it. And so there's actually three main elements of self-compassion. There's being present with yourself, acknowledging we're in pain or we're hurting. There's the kindness and the warmth, but also a sense of common humanity. This is the key that differentiates pity from compassion.
Mm.
So, Michelle, if I were to pity you, you wouldn't like it because that'd be a sense of separation. I'd be looking down on you like, oh, poor Michelle. But
Mm-hmm.
if I have compassion for you, it's like, oh, Michelle, I've been there. That's only human. There's a sense of connectedness.
Yeah.
And the same thing with self-compassion. Pity is
Mm.
poor me. No one else can understand my travails.
Right.
So that's self-pity. It's self-focus. Self-compassion, by definition, the way at least I've defined it, we frame our experience in light of the shared human experience. We remember that to be human means to be imperfect, to make mistakes. We fall down and we get back up again, and that's how we learn and that's how we grow. We aren't superhuman robots.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we have self compassion, it's like, wow, as a human being, this is hard. I'm not the only one. It doesn't mean we're
Mm-hmm.
comparing, like yes, of course, people suffer different
Mm-hmm.
ways, different amounts, but we frame the experience of hardship in light of the shared human experience. And that's where we draw our strength from, actually.
Mm. Talk about You just use the word comparing. I was thinking, wow, I'm wondering how much more self-compassion is needed now with social media. I
Yeah.
mean, this is all I remember. I mean, I don't see clients anymore, but when I did, it was when social media was really coming online. I stopped seeing clients about 4 years ago, but it was when, suddenly there's Facebook and then there's Instagram and all of these things. And I found my clients continuing to come in, and a lot of them were really feeling thrown by so and so was posting this on social media. So then they felt bad, worse about themselves. And it was like, there's what the heck is going on in our world? And I'm thinking about
Mm.
self compassion, comparison. It's
Yes.
so hard to not compare yourself to someone else that you're seeing on social media. We forget that they've taken about 100 videos and they're posting the perfect video and the perfect light and the perfect everything.
Yeah.
Talk about, have you seen and I know the answer to this question, but as far as overwhelm, anxiety, and things like that, since the era of social media, which what has it been, 15 years now that it's really come online?
Yeah. And so I think what social media is tapping into, what you're pointing to, is actually a broader distinction between a self-compassion and self-esteem. Actually,
Mm,
my first study was titled like self-compassion, a healthier alternative to self-esteem. So it's really important to know the difference. Both are forms of self-worth. The
mhm,
self-worth of self-compassion comes from being a flawed human being like everyone else. I'm intrinsically worthy because I'm a human being.
mm, mm,
Self-esteem, the word esteem is like a judgment or an evaluation. Am I worthy or not? It's not presumed, right? And why am I worthy? It's because I'm special and above average. I mean, let's face it, Michelle. If I said your podcast is average, you'd be like, oh. And if you said, Kristin, your work is average, I'm gonna be like, oh,
ew.
because self-esteem is inherently, for most people, comparative, right?
Mhm,
So we feel good about ourselves when we're special and above average. When other people are perceived to do better than us, our sense of self-worth takes a hit. With self-compassion, because it's not comparative, it's like,
mm,
inherent to our humanness. It's not based on social comparison. So this is, whether the whole advertising, for instance, world feeds on the need for comparative self-esteem. Buy our jeans and you'll be worthy. And
yeah.
social media also feeds like a vulture on this need for social comparison and feeling good about ourselves. And so
Mhm,
how many likes do you have? Oh, she looks
mhm,
great in that photo. Is she using filter? I mean, I have friends who are my age, middle-aged women, they put filters on and they look like they're 30. It was like, that's not reality. So our self-esteem is being based on this illusion. And that bit has really been negative. It was already bad, social
yeah.
comparison. It's always
Yeah.
been a problem.
Yep.
But it's really kind of on social comparison on steroids now with social media.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really difficult when we need to give ourselves compassion for all the pain we feel on social media. I mean, social media itself is, can be used for good or for bad. I
Mhm.
mean, our work, we use social media to get our message out, so it's not
Right.
inherently bad. But when we start using it as a source of self-esteem, that's when it starts really amplifying our suffering.
Such a good point there. I'm thinking about the kids of today and how they're growing up with it, and that's what they're doing. This is where they get their self-esteem. I mean, kind of
Exactly.
scary, you know?
Very, can be very superficial. I mean, again, it's not always, there are podcasts like yours. There are ways in which it can be used to deepen people. But I think
Mhm.
most people aren't using it in that deeper way. They're using it just to get their like little self-esteem fix or the dopamine fix of, oh, interesting story. Or, it's kind of,
Yeah.
it's starting to harm people's ability to think deeply or to even focus for a long time. And that's the slightly scary bit about it.
What about when we're talking about motivation? Something I think I read from you was about motivating kids. That was fascinating. How you actually, I think about so many parents that I know personally and professionally. We would, if you don't get these grades or if you don't do this, then you're in trouble or you're grounded or whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do we motivate not just you talked about ourselves, but what about our kids?
Yeah.
Using self-compassion, 'cause when I read what you wrote, I was like, "Well, this is flipped, like, this is not what I would think."
Well, it's not just if you don't get good grades, you'll be grounded. It's also if you get good grades, I will love you. Or you're
Yes.
such a good boy or good girl. You got great grades, So some the positive dangling the positive carrot can also be
Yeah.
harmful. I mean,
Yeah.
not as harmful as like the negative stuff. But again, what you're doing is you're telling your kids that their worth is contingent on
Mhm.
success,
Yeah.
on performance, on getting it right, on getting those A's. And that's the problem because this isn't going to surprise you, Michelle. It's a truism, but it's true. Failure is our best teacher,
Ooh,
right?
yeah.
So if we aren't allowed to fail, how are we going to learn from our failures? And so
Mhm.
some people think that self-compassion, like this bottom line of unconditional self-worth, means we'll lower our standards. If my self-worth isn't contingent on getting that A plus, well, I'll just settle for the B plus. I won't try as hard. What That's not true. What is true though is the reason for why you want that A plus or to get the very best shifts. You don't do it just to feel good about yourself because you feel good
Mhm.
about yourself inherently. You do it because you care, because it's important to you. And so maybe if it's not that important to your life goals, maybe it's not so important to get that A plus. But if it is, you'll do it. So here's an example. We published a study last year with NCAA athletes. So in the states, these are like we're top level UT Austin, where I'm at, and other teams.
Mhm.
Second best is not good enough. I mean, these kids, their scholarships are based on their performance. A lot of them want to go into the pros, make their career out of it. So, but this is really truly important to who they are. So we taught athletes how to be more self-compassionate when they had a mistake in their games or their training routine. We actually didn't, interestingly, we didn't use the word self-compassion because we knew it would just create all this baggage that was unnecessary. We called it inner strength training. Right. And we
Wow.
help them imagine the ideal coach who a compassionate coach gives it to you straight. They aren't going to say that there is not a problem if there is, because the
Mhm.
most helpful thing a coach can do is help you improve your game, but done from a perspective, I believe in you. You can do it. I'm here for you. How can I help you? So supportive, compassionate coach, as opposed to like the mean, belittling coach, you're a piece of
Mhm.
crap because you didn't do that well,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And what we found, not only did it increase self-compassion in their mental health, it increased their performance, both self-rated and coach-rated athletic performance.
Wow.
So, and because of this very simple thing, if you're worried about, I think about athletes. If they're worried about if I don't make the shot, what it's going to say about me, they are not in the flow state. They are not going to be able to be at their best.
Yep.
When they do their best, they're in that flow state. They aren't thinking about themselves. They're
Yep.
just doing what they've been trained to do. That's facilitated by self-compassion, from this idea that if I fail, that's okay. I'll just learn and grow. That gives you the sense of safety needed. And there is an empirical connection between self-compassion and flow, which is part of the reason I think it's so good for athletes. And so we could talk about athletics,
Ooh.
school, business. We get the same over and over again. Self-compassion actually increases performance.
Wow.
It doesn't make you lower your standards.
And I would wonder as you're saying that, like, that's fascinating. And I love that it's interesting you had to change what you called it. It wasn't called self-compassion. But I
Yeah.
would wonder, I'm sure you've done some study on this, but what happened also in their personal lives because of what they were doing basically at work as athletes? They're learning the self-compassion. Did it trickle into their personal lives? Did it trickle into their relationships, to how they parent, to etc.?
Yeah, so we don't have research on that, but I know. So one of my ex dissertation students who did the study with me, she's got a training company in this field, and she, just a personal story she talked about is these college athletes. Not only did it improve their game, it really did help change their life. That's why the coaches were on board, because coaches, of course, care about their players' mental health.
Wow.
And so, in a lot of the research, yeah, it helps you at work, but
Mhm.
it does generalize to other areas of your life. I mean, the research, it's just like there's so much research. A friend of mine said it's getting boring because it shows the same thing. It's good in your relationships. It's good for parenting. It's good for leadership. It's good at work. It's good for exercise. I mean, the reason it's so good is, think about it. Anything you want to do in life, if you're an ally, if you have your own back, if you're going to support and care for yourself, and desire health for yourself, of
Mhm.
course it's going to lead to better outcomes. It's really a no-brainer. That's why sometimes I think, like, well, it is catching on, but like it's so obvious to me.
Oh my God, it is to me
You
too.
know, but remember, it seems obvious, but there are reasons we don't do it. Evolution. We're
Yeah.
programmed to be hard on ourselves. So don't beat yourself up for not seeing the light. And culture as well. I think that's
Yeah.
starting to shift slowly,
Yeah.
but our
Yeah.
culture doesn't really help us. So maybe once our culture helps us, we'll override the biological instinct a little more easily. I don't know.
So when you say biological instinct, is it
Yeah.
is the reason that we're so hard on ourselves, let's say our inner judger, our inner critic,
Mhm.
whatever you want to call it, right? It feels bad, whatever that
Yeah.
inner voice is, right? Would you say that that's coming from our ego, or is that just coming from just part of who we are because it's been passed down? And again, I'm splitting hairs here, but I was just curious
Yeah.
what your thought is around that.
So it depends how you're gonna make you have to define ego, but if you define ego as sense of self, I
Mhm.
would say the arising of the emotions or the reaction, for instance, the feeling of shame.
Yeah.
Uh in even if you were in a state where there's not a lot of ego or sense of self going on, um, the sense of shame is actually biologically programmed into us, that when we feel we've done something that's maybe harmed others, the sense of shame arises as just even a physical sensation.
Mm,
Now, it's more likely to arise. We're more likely to think about, have we harmed others or done something embarrassing, if we're
mhm,
focused on our ego. And of course, if we are really focused on our ego, it's going to make it worse. It's going to exacerbate the shame and everything. But it doesn't mean, like, you might be an enlightened meditation master. In certain situations, the feeling of the experience of shame might arise just naturally, just like anger arises, just like fear arises. Some of
mm,
these are just part of the fact that we're in human bodies. But
mm,
do we attach to it? Do we identify it with it? Do we exacerbate it? Or do we just see it rise up and fall away? So, for instance, shame still arises for me, absolutely. Even though
mhm,
I've been practicing self compassion for 20 years, it still arises, but I
mhm,
don't fixate on it. I actually give myself compassion for feeling shame,
mm,
and it arises and it lingers forever long it's going to linger, and then eventually it passes.
mm.
So, we are human beings in human bodies, and there are some things that have just been given to us by the way our brains interact with other people and social situations, that we don't
Right.
con- we don't control our thoughts and emotions. I have a feeling that's not going to be news to you.
No, not news to me. Yeah.
Yeah,
th- they come out of left field for sure.
they do. Yeah,
But I would say, based on what you're saying, if you're somebody that is what I would call the master of self-compassion,
yeah.
if I may call you a master around self-compassion, the guru of self-compassion. If you're
Oh, no,
all right, just
okay.
let it
Anyway,
land.
okay,
Just
all
take
right,
it
all
in.
right. Okay, sorry.
Take it in, sister.
Call me
Okay,
Kristin G. Sorry. Okay.
so if you are someone that is experiencing shame,
Yeah.
then yes, again, we have we're spiritual beings in a human body, so we're
Yeah.
still having
Yeah.
but I want to ask you this question. Do you notice that the shame comes up less and lingers for less time? And what's
Uh,
different about it compared to the
yeah.
before you were the
Yeah.
self-compassion guru?
Yeah. So it comes up less often. Kind of, I mean, I still make mistakes as much, maybe not as much as ever. I still do. I mean,
Yeah.
I always say, thank goodness I'm a self-compassion teacher, not a mindfulness teacher, because
Mhm.
I don't have to pretend to be like, I'm always so mindful. I never say anything I regret. No, I'm still very human, and I'm kind of short-tempered, and just you look at my mom, you'd understand why, you know. So I still make mistakes, and when I make a mistake, especially one that goes against my values, like, oh, I really wish I hadn't sent that email type thing, the shame still arises.
Mhm.
But really, what is different is, instead of saying, like, oh, Kristin, you're a bad person, la la la, it's like I just feel it. Like, I feel it mainly as a physical sensation. I'm
Mhm.
there for myself. It doesn't last very long. And then very quickly, like almost like 30 seconds after I sent the email, my apology email comes.
Yep.
So in other words, it still arises, and shame is a useful emotion because it really is a signal.
Mhm.
You it depends why you're feeling shame, but sometimes it's a signal that you've done something that's against your values. In that case, it's really more like guilt. But sometimes it actually is more like guilt. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I've I've been I've done something bad.
It did something. Yeah.
And so for me, it's more guilt, but it still feels like shame. Like, how do you know it's shame? Oftentimes, like there's this white hot feeling that spreads throughout your body.
Hmm.
You can then feel it in your face, and it's almost like energetically, it's like a almost this boom, this hot feeling, like, oh, I can't believe I did that, or I wish I hadn't done that, or something like that. So that does still arise, but it doesn't last
Doesn't
very
stick.
long. Yeah, it
It's not
doesn't
sticking
stick,
like it used to
especially if
stick.
I
Yeah.
hold it in compassion. So one of the things, one of the ways you practice self-compassion is the three elements: mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness. You can think of it as loving, connected presence, or
Mm.
it's like
Hmm.
a warm, connected spaciousness, which is another way to talk about presence. So
Hmm.
one of the things I'll do is I'll actually imagine myself. Often we identify with our thoughts and feelings, like, oh, I am bad, or I've got the thought I'm bad, or I can't believe I did that, or this hurts. And so when you remember that you're bigger than that thought and feeling, you're actually this warm, loving presence, then
Hmm.
I actually physically imagine myself being this warm, loving spaciousness. And I just
Mm.
allow that feeling of shame to arise in the spaciousness. I don't cling to it, I don't merge with it. I just kind of see it and allow it to arise. I don't try to push it away or shame myself for feeling it. And then it just goes more quickly.
That you just said something.
And I don't build a story out of it, which is so important, as you know, when the story of you and who you are, and all that. So,
Oh God, I just lost what you said. I was just going to say you said
oh,
something so important.
about I don't build a story about it, make a story of it.
Prior to that, wait, what'd you say?
The warm spaciousness I allow
No, like it
feel.
comes in, but you see yourself separate from it. And I think what we do as humans oftentimes is we'll say, "Oh, I'm so bad. I can't believe I did that."
Yes.
And then we pile on. Where what I'm hearing you say is you separate self. So let's talk about the two selves.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got the small s and the capital S. So talk about those two.
Yeah, so I'm increasingly talking about self-compassion as a process of switching from the perspective of kind of small self, which we feel separate, we feel limited, we feel, flawed, we feel less capable, and
Mhm.
self with a capital S, in which we're connected with the whole. We feel naturally
Yeah.
compassionate. We feel much more empowered, much more capable. And so compassion, actually, the self receiving the compassion is often our small s self, the one that feels like hurt, ashamed, or not good enough, or flawed. But the self giving the compassion is our big S self.
Yeah.
You know, and we know this, we know what it feels like when we're feeling compassion for others, which is a much more common experience. Let's say your friend comes to you and so upset. When you're with your friend, typically we aren't thinking so much about ourselves, right? We're with our
Yeah.
friend, we're with their pain, we're thinking, how can I help this person? And we feel connected to them. The warmth is naturally arising. So we're
Mm.
more in the presence of our big self. There's lots of experiences. Maybe in nature you have it, or with your kids, or
Yeah.
having a moment of quiet. Um, but the problem with, I shouldn't say the problem, the challenge with self compassion is when we're aiming inward to the small self, we tend to naturally be identified with our small self. And then we think, it feels fake to give myself compassion. Well, it does feel fake for the small self to give compassion,
Right.
right? We aren't used to it. It feels awkward. It feels hard. We may think, oh, I wasn't given compassion. I don't know how to do it. But big self has no problem with compassion because big self is not really there's no separation in big self. Big self is our ability to tap into the larger whole, being, presence, whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
So it's almost like there's the wave in the ocean, to use, it's a
Mhm.
common metaphor, but it's so
I love
useful.
it. I love
Right?
this
So
metaphor though.
if the
Yeah.
wave is the small self and the
Mhm.
ocean is the big self, then normally we're trapped on the waves on the surface and it's choppy. We feel like out of control, especially when it's stormy weather.
Mhm.
And then so what you're doing when you're giving yourself compassion, also the same process when you're giving someone else compassion, is we're going down into the ocean itself, which is
Mhm.
calmer, it's more peaceful, it's more loving. And then that's kind of the source of compassion.
Mhm.
So you may think of it as just a shift into this bigger self. That's why actually one of the most effective ways to give yourself compassion, we show in research, is just to imagine, what if I had a very good friend, a loved friend who was going through the exact same thing I was going through? So you might
Yeah.
imagine, okay, let's say, Jill was going through this situation.
Mhm.
How would I respond? What would I feel? Then what we're doing when we do that is we're actually accessing our big self, our compassionate self.
Mhm.
And then you just kind of flip it and do it towards yourself, but still coming from that perspective of big
Mm.
self. This is the
So
thing. It's actually not that difficult. What's challenging is to remember, again, because of culture and evolutionary reasons, it doesn't come totally naturally at first. It's easier with time. It really is.
I love what you just said because I think on our planet right now, people are starting to recognize the fact that there are two selves and that we are connected to something much bigger than
Yeah.
who we are. And I don't mean like a little man on a cloud up in the sky. Like there's a
Yeah.
big, giant source of unconditionally loving energy. And we are very much part of that. And we've
Yeah.
come down here to have this experience in human form in our human suits. And that's our little tiny s self that is having these experiences where we're beating up on ourselves and we're in the inner critic and the inner judger. And then
Mhm.
it's almost like we can shift a dial with self compassion and we can almost go into a remembering because I have that experience that you're speaking of. Like, hold on a second. It's not who I am. Like, I'm
Yeah.
part of the ocean, right? I'm part of
Yeah.
this bigger energy. And then we tap into that beautiful energetic flow state. And all of a
Right.
sudden, everything feels like it expands out. Not only am I thinking loving thoughts, but I feel the love coming
Yeah.
through me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the shame is evaporated, the depression, the sadness, the whatever. And again, I don't say that lightly. I was someone that was depressed 20 some years ago. I don't
Yeah.
say that lightly. So
Yeah.
please
Yeah.
hear me now. But using a tool like self compassion is a tool that we should use from now until the day we die, honestly, because it can turn around. Talk about this for a moment. Things like depression and anxiety and some of these things that so many of us humans struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way you talk about that. And it's funny, people don't talk about it enough. And I usually don't even talk about it necessarily publicly, but it's so true. Sometimes I'll just be sitting in my backyard and I'll start resonating with the ocean.
Yes.
And it feels good. Like physically, it feels good. It's almost
Yep.
like having a few glasses of wine. It's like,
Mhm.
you feel more relaxed, you feel more energized. It's actually very pleasant. That's where happiness and peace is. Because
Exactly.
we think of us as waves on the ocean. And by the way, it's important that it's not like the ocean is our true self and the wave is our false self. We are both. We are both the ocean
Yes.
and the wave simultaneously. And also, waves have, that's where individuality is. That's where works of art get created. That's where,
Yep.
like music and, it's not like one's even better than the other.
Nope.
But the problem is when we're identified with being a wave and we forget about the ocean. So you might say when we're identified with our separate self, and we forget that actually we are also the ocean simultaneously, then it's like all these waves, like they feel all alone. They're trying to connect with other waves and they can't. And it's like,
Yes.
and then we feel anxious and we feel like afraid and we feel lonely and we feel separate. Like it's just because we've forgotten that, oh, yeah, we're also, yes, we are a wave. It's not like we aren't. We are also the ocean. And that's like a big also. It's not
It's
like
a
we are
big
also
also.
big
Yeah.
also, you know. And I
Yes.
mean, I don't think, some of my feeling is you don't want to do this as spiritual bypass. So some people,
Right.
I don't think put you in this category at all. Some people say, oh, well, don't worry about it. You're really
No.
just the ocean. You're really just, we're all one. We're all peaceful, because there's a
Mm-mm.
lot of suffering going on among the
Absolutely.
waves. Wars are being fought. People are being
Yep.
abused. Trauma is
Absolutely.
happening.
Mhm.
So we don't want to like somehow think the ocean is the only thing that's important and we forget about the suffering of the waves.
Yep.
But we do want to, because our, you might say our true nature is that we are both, we're our individual wave and we're the whole ocean simultaneously.
Yeah.
That we have to work to alleviate suffering. What is compassion about? That's like the ocean trying to alleviate the suffering of the waves. The
Yes.
ocean cares about the suffering of the waves, also adores and loves the beauty and creativity created among the waves, but
Hmm.
cares about the suffering of the waves. And we need to care about our own individual suffering and the suffering of others. So
Hmm.
it's not like we just need to bypass that. So, for instance, let's say a feeling of pain or shame arises. Some people might say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I'm just the ocean. We're all one. That's like, that's it's not facing the reality. And that's why you get some spiritual teachers, they're just revving with the ocean. And as a wave, they're like abusing people or like not living
Yes.
purely.
Yeah.
Because you gotta be both the ocean and the wave. Both are true. And then ultimately it's like, is there even a difference between the ocean and the wave? And we can get
Mhm.
into philosophy, which I don't think we even need to do. But I think experientially, and this is something you can actually do. And sometimes I usually don't talk about this, but because you went there and because maybe your audience is used to it, it's really a way you can access compassion, self compassion, like recognize, oh, okay, I'm identified with small self. Let me just drop into my big self, the ocean, for a moment. And
Yeah.
wherever you do that, you might drop into it by thinking about how you would treat a friend. You might drop into it by like, oh, what would Obi-Wan Kenobi say right now? Maybe some cultural myth of people who kind of, or a
Yeah.
spiritual teacher or Jesus or
Yeah.
whatever works for you in terms of, kind of it's expressing what it feels like to be in the ocean.
Yeah.
And then that's a way when you drop into the ocean. But then remember, you want to come back to that wave. You don't want to leave that wave stranded. Come back to your sense of self and be there for yourself. And yes, it hurts, and it hurts to feel separate. And I'm in pain right now. And so it's not all there is to happen.
Right.
Again, it's both. But how can I embrace the pain, embrace that feeling of separation, give myself that love and that feeling of connectedness? And then
Mhm.
what happens is the waves are changing constantly anyway.
Constantly.
You just and
Constantly.
then that wave just changes, and then some other emotion or thought or feeling is going to arise.
I had a spiritual teacher one time. She said to me, I was going through a really hard time. And I said, I can't handle the pain. She goes, okay, you can feel the pain. I go, well, what do I do after that? She goes, and you breathe.
Yeah,
I said, oh, what a concept, and I was like, oh yeah, you're right. And it doesn't last.
it doesn't
We
last.
keep breathing.
Yeah,
And then I'm able to go through the words of, okay, now let me bring on self-compassion. But sometimes it's I can't even breathe. And it's like, oh, wait, I can breathe and feel right at the same time. I'm in the wave.
yeah.
And then I'm going to keep going and with breath. And all of a sudden I'll go, okay, well, maybe I can make it through. And talk a little bit with us about how, give us some examples of self-compassion. And by the way, it's not for women only. Let me say that again.
Absolutely. Yeah,
It's for every human on the planet.
yeah,
But how do we, and I like that you changed it for for the guys in on the basketball team, for the basketball team, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Whatever term you got to use, we've got to start practicing self-compassion because it does bring you back into that oneness state. Call it the
yeah,
ocean, call it the source, call it God, call it universe, whatever the heck it is. It's where
yeah.
we're all from. So, how do we get ourselves back there using self-compassion? Because it's hard to make that jump from the yardstick going from, 0 to 46. It's like, no, how do we go 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to how do we move up that stick?
Yeah, so it's really there's no right way to practice self-compassion. It really is what works for you. So for some people, for instance, they're more physically oriented.
Mhm.
There's a research study that just came out earlier this year that showed 20 seconds a day, 20 seconds a day of doing something like putting your hands on your heart and just saying, I'm here for you, dramatically increases your mental well-being. So
Wow.
the reason touch is so important is because remember, part of the instinct to criticize ourselves comes from our physiology, from our, it has to do with like the sympathetic nervous system arousal state. So you
Yeah.
put your hands on your body, you're probably activating the vagus nerve. It's not this, we think so, we don't know for sure. But what we do know is you're actually moving into parasympathetic reaction,
Mhm.
lowering cortisol and those reactions, increasing heart
Mhm.
rate variability just by, and it just, if that's too much, you can do like a fist of strength. You can touch your face. You can, whatever works. You can do arms akimbo, like Wonder Woman, whatever works for you to feel physically supported. That's a very good way for many people, just that little physical gesture. Um, there is things like you just imagining how would I treat a friend, or what would Ted Lasso say to me, or so no, literally whatever works.
Yeah.
Imagery, thinking how you treat a friend. For some people, meditation is a really powerful way of actually changing your habitual reactions, but it's not for everything. And our research shows it actually doesn't matter what you do, whether you
Mm,
meditate, whether you do 20 seconds of hand on heart, or you say something like the self-compassion break, you bring in the 3 components of compassion.
mhm.
What does matter is that you just practice this response when you suffer. The more
Yeah.
you practice, the more the stronger the habit will be.
Yeah. I used to tell my clients, imagine having, a parent that loves you, a grandparent, aunt, uncle, best friend. I don't care
Yes.
who it is, but imagine that they're standing right next to you as you're
Yeah.
beating up on yourself, as you're in this horrible space. What
Yeah.
would they say to you? Like,
Yeah.
just imagine them right next to you or in front of you. Let them speak to you to help move you out of that state that you're in.
Yeah.
I love
I
that.
also think of part psychology is very, very useful. I'm friends with Dick Shorts, created internal family systems. There's a lot of part psychologies,
Yeah,
recognizing that it's just a part of
that's
us
it.
is criticizing ourselves. And that part actually thinks it's helping.
It
We
does.
don't want to
Oh,
demonize
yeah.
that part. It's the only language it knows how to use. That's its role. It thinks it's going to help you stay safe, ward off danger, maybe change your behavior so you'll be less vulnerable,
I do a ton
so
of parts work with this adult chair model. Ours
yeah,
is more spiritual parts work.
right.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely believe a whole bunch of parts made up. It's like a whole bunch of pieces to a pie
We're,
made up into the
we
whole
aren't
soul.
one wave. We're actually lots of
We're
waves.
lots of waves. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell us one last point. I just want to ask you. We're just touched on something like depression.
Mhm.
Um, what is the research around, I don't know, depression, anxiety, that kind of thing? And you even mentioned suicide.
Yeah,
Talk
yeah.
about that just for a moment before we end here.
Yeah. And also I want to touch on burnout a little bit, which is
Yes,
related.
yes, yes. We'll do that
So,
after.
the research really is overwhelming how powerful it is for all those negative mind states, because basically depression, anxiety, stress, and suicidal ideation is really a way to try to escape pain.
Yes.
Depression
Yeah.
is a way of like shutting down in response to pain. Anxiety is being worried about pain, is desire to prevent pain that might
Mhm.
happen. So all these are related to how, not um, being overwhelmed by pain.
Mhm.
And so what compassion does is, because you might say it's a way of wrapping our pain with love and support and a feeling of connectedness and presence. So what that does is it prevents the downward spiral into these things like suicidal
Mm,
ideation or depression or anxiety, because you have another way to cope with the pain. Or eating disorders, alcoholism, all these things are ways to try to cope with pain.
right.
So when you have self-compassion, you have a healthier way to cope with your pain, and it's
Mhm.
actually more effective. And that's why it's so powerful in reducing these negative mind states, including, I wanted to mention burnout because I have a new book out on
Yeah,
called
please.
Mindful Self-Compassion to Burnout. And burnout is so ubiquitous, and sometimes it's people maybe with mental health struggles. Often it's just because
Mhm.
people, they're in a situation that's untenable. They're
Yeah.
overworked, or like you're a healthcare worker and you can't do your job, or the system's broken, and the natural response is to burn out, which is kind of burnout is a little bit like depression. There's elements of there. We become exhausted and we shut down because
Mhm.
we're so overwhelmed by the stress we're facing. We stop
Mm,
caring as much. It's called depersonalization. We stop caring as much about ourselves and others because it just hurts too much, the fact that we can't get things done the way we want.
mm,
And we feel incompetent because we blame ourselves for not
yeah.
being able to cope.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of research showing that self-compassion is a really effective antidote to burnout. So if you're in a situation where you've got kind of overwhelming stress,
Mhm.
instead of blaming yourself, instead of just shutting down, you have another way to cope with that overwhelming stress, right? The
Mm,
tender self-compassion, the acceptance is, this is overwhelming. So it's kind of like,
mhm.
I'm not going to blame myself for it. Any human being would react this way in this situation. That's the
Right.
tender. And the fierce is, well, is there anything I can do? I can't fix it, but maybe I can draw some boundaries. Maybe I
Mhm.
can change the situation. Maybe I can do small little things, like small little breaks to meet my needs during the day. I'm going to reject the notion, like, for instance, nurses, often it's like, oh, the patient comes first. No, I can't.
No.
I got to put my own oxygen mask on in order to,
Yes.
that type of thing.
Yeah.
And so I just, this new book really talks about how self-compassion can very powerfully help people reduce burnout and recover from
Mm.
burnout, and also prevent it from happening in the first place.
Mm.
So,
Thank you so much for that. I will go ahead and put that right in the show notes. And this was wonderful. Thank
yes,
you.
thank you. Thank you.
Kristen Neff, you're
Hopefully we'll
just
talk
amazing.
again.
Yeah, for sure. Where
Thank you.
would people find you?
So very easy. Just Google self-compassion or go to selfcompassion.org. You can find me. You can take the self-compassion test I created, measure your own level. I've got lots of free practices, downloadable practices.
Okay,
I
great.
also have a self-compassion community if you want to like have events with me, or we have mentor sessions. Oh, we're actually starting free introduction to self-compassion sessions
Ooh,
taught by my mentors. So if you want to just take an hour-long session and just check it out, no cost, no obligation. You don't have to like sign anything on the dotted line.
love that. And that's
Get a
all
little
at
taste. All at
selfcompassion.org.
selfcompassion.org. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So wonderful to have you again. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Michelle.